Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's podcast. We're so excited to be able to have with us Craig Whitney, founder of Multiply Project. And he is leading us in a 3-day virtual workshop. We have so far completed workshop number 1. And if you haven't had an opportunity to listen or watch, you could go ahead and visit our website, texaschurchofgod.org. And also visit us on that page. We have a link that's Recalibrate Podcast. You can go on YouTube at Recalibrate TXM and also on Spotify and iTunes as well. Well, today we're going to lean into workshop number 2, from delegating to developing. And I am excited because Craig has a heart for multiplication. He has experience in multiplication. And I know we're going to be blessed today as Craig leads us in part 2 of this workshop.
Great to be back with you. Great to be back with everyone that's on the call today. Let me go ahead and share my screen, make sure that everybody can see what we're going to be talking about. Did that show up for everyone there? Awesome. All right. So last in our first session, I guess it's been about 4 weeks ago now. And there's that link again. You've shared that in the chat, right? Chelsea, yep, we're good to go. All right. So last time we talked about this shift to becoming a multiplying church. And so I want to just go back and say, what is a multiplying church? When you hear that phrase, I was talking with somebody this week and realized how much sort of the idea of being a multiplying church has kind of been embedded into the language of our churches, at least in the American context. A lot of that's because of exponential. But I wonder sometimes, do we really know what that means, and do we really know how to do that? And so this is just sort of a simple definition I have of a multiplying church. A multiplying church produces spiritual generations of disciples, leaders, and churches. In the same way that you would say, people or any other living thing multiplies by producing generations of its being, the same thing is true of the church. And our focus in these workshops is to talk about 3 shifts. Just not how to change your whole church. In some ways you could implement all this and people in your church might take a month to even figure out that you were doing something different. This is not that kind of wholesale change where you get up on Sunday morning and tell everybody, hey, our church is going to be completely different from now on. It's just some behaviors on your part that will begin to shift your church toward multiplication. And last time we talked about from what to who. And that's the idea of a scouting guide. Just like we have plans and calendars, having a scouting guide to think about who are the future multipliers in our church. And then today we're going to talk about from delegating to developing. How do we actually develop those people so they become multipliers? And then our next session, about 4 weeks from now, we're going to talk about how do we move from equipping members to actually equipping missionaries who are really capable of going out and making disciples and starting churches and really seeing multiplication happen out of and through our church. So today we're going to focus on that middle one. We talked about 3 new rhythms last time, right? Create a scouting guide, but then 3 new rhythms. Daily prayer, just every day pray for some person you've identified as a potential multiplier. Weekly influence, once a week, just having a conversation with someone on the phone, on a Zoom, on coffee, a lunch, a breakfast, whatever it be, have a conversation, and then to update your progress every month. Pretty simple pattern. And again, today we're going to talk about that middle thing, that weekly influence. How do you do this? How do you have these conversations? And we want to give you some really simple, really basic, honestly, just pretty easy to accomplish tools for accomplishing this. So before we dive in, let me pray for all of you, and then we'll get into this, the specifics of this content. Lord, I'm thankful for those that are part of the call today. Just a desire on their part to explore, to learn, to understand more about multiplication. I'm grateful for the roles that you've given them in leading their churches and the work that they do. I know it's not always easy. It can be challenging. But Lord, I pray that for them it's fruitful and they can see the ways that you are working in people's lives. And I pray that through what we talk about today, they will see how their church can become multiplying, that the good things, the good fruit that's happening would actually increase and multiply through others as they begin to share and do the work of ministry, the work of disciple making, the work of leading churches, even of planting churches. We pray in your name. Amen. Awesome. All right, let's jump in here. So again, this shift is a multiplying church focuses on developing people more than delegating tasks. Now, one of the things that you'll realize as we go through is none of the things that I'm talking about are shifts Like, you're not going to give up on delegating tasks. It's not like that's going to end in your church. What we're trying to do is elevate another thing actually above that. And that's this idea of developing people. Now, what does that look like? And why is that significant? Or we talked last time about how our churches get focused on the doing, right? And so we're always asking it, we're always planning, what are we going to do next? What are we going to do to grow our church? What are we going to do to help people grow more like Jesus? What are we going to do to grow more finances so we can keep our church? We're always asking this what question. We wanted to shift that to a who question. But the reality is all of that focus on what causes us to constantly be asking, how can we get more people to do more of what we already are doing, more of what we already have planned, right? And I don't know how you have felt about this, but the statistics say that this has become even more challenging. Excuse me. There is a research project that was started. It's called the Exploring the Pandemic Impact on Congregations. So it was started in 2020. It's supposed to run through 2025. They came out with a report last spring that they said volunteerism in churches specifically dropped from about 40% of membership in early 2020, remember, before the pandemic, to 20% in March 2020, sort of after the pandemic. So you just have to picture this. I'm going to try this. So before the pandemic, 2 out of 5 people in your church were volunteering. Like if you were a typical church, according to their research. After the pandemic, 1 out of 5 people in your church is volunteering. Now, I can't see the chat right now, but if any of you want to type amen in the chat, you're allowed to do that. Like, yep, that's exactly what we're experiencing at our church. But here's what's interesting. One of the most commonly recommended ways to increase volunteerism, and not just in the church, by the way, in any volunteer-based organization, is to focus on developing people first. Right? So this is not just like, oh, forget it, you'll never have any volunteers. This is actually will lead to more volunteers. It's demonstrated that it does that. And it's not a chicken and egg thing, right? You guys know what a chicken egg scenario is, right? Or we can't really decide which thing comes first, right? More chickens make more eggs, make more chickens. So what does it matter if you start with a chicken or you start with the egg? Either way, you end up in the same place. But this is not that. This is actually more like what we talked about last week, which is a planting seed and harvesting fruit thing, right? And the reality is, if you plant one seed, you get one fruit, or maybe the plant produces a little bit of fruit. If you plant a lot of seeds, you get a lot of fruit. And so there's this reality to the more we invest in developing people, the more fruit we get out of that. And so there's a shift of question that happens, right? Instead of asking, how can we find more children's workers? We ask, who can we develop into a multiplier of children's workers, right? Instead of asking, how can we find more small group leaders? We ask, who can we develop into a multiplier of group leaders? Instead of asking, how can we get more churches? We ask, who can we develop into a church planter? I have a really good friend here. It's kind of confusing because his name is Craig as well. You can pray for him because he had his hip replacement on Monday. And so I need to go visit him. I had a cough, so I haven't wanted to go see him and get him sick. But he and I met 25 years ago when I came to Sacramento, was part of a church here. He was leading a small group, which was great. But I spent about, you can figure this out, I spent about, 30 minutes with him, maybe a lunch, coffee, something. I was like, this guy shouldn't just be leading a small group. This guy should be developing small group leaders. And I got him engaged in that. Now, it turns out just kind of where some of his skill came. He was a sales manager. So I don't know if any of you have ever been in sales or not. Like a sales manager's job is to develop salespeople, right? It's not to sell, it's to develop salespeople. And so I turned him loose on developing small group leaders. Our church went from having like 10 small groups to 25 small groups in about 18 months. Now, I helped. I'll be honest, I helped, but I could have never done it without him. And so it is actually possible to develop people into developers, to develop multipliers. And it's so awesome to be able to see when that actually bears its fruit. And it looks like this, right? Like when we actually develop people, what you start to realize is imagine you're the first person in the sequence, right? You develop someone, and then at some point you look down the road and you realize, someone else has been developed for ministry, and I didn't do it. Somebody else did it. That's the whole idea of multiplication, is that things move through generations. And so that's what we want to talk about. But there are some shifts that have to happen, mindset shifts that have to happen, I think, in order to really do this effectively. Probably a little over a year ago, I injured my shoulder. Now, I am of a certain age. I actually have two really good friends who both completely blew out their shoulders and had to have surgery. That's what happens when you get to be my age. You do those kinds of things to your body. Fortunately, I didn't completely tear mine, didn't have to go have surgery, but I had to do several months of intense physical therapy, whatever, to sort of rehabilitate. Like, I couldn't even do what I'm doing right now. I couldn't lift my arm, right? But here's what happened when I injured my arm. I couldn't put a shirt on the way I had always put a shirt on. Because I'm right-handed, I had spent my whole life putting a button-up shirt on by putting my right arm in first. And then I would reach around with my left arm and, kind of pull my shirt on. But I couldn't reach around behind me with my left arm. I couldn't put a shirt on until I figured out I have to put my left arm in first. Does anybody have any idea how difficult that was? It took me weeks, months to do it. And guess what I still do today? I put my shirt on with my left arm first, because once I convinced my brain to do it that way, I was not going to go back. Okay. Like I wasn't going to try and go back the other way. There's a term for this, and the term is called neuroplasticity. I don't know, like, if any of you ever heard that term, but it's the idea, and I think the reality that we aren't really even aware of is we have no idea how much of what we do every day is actually done out of habit. That we don't actually think about it, or we think about just the first piece of it, and then we do the rest of it sort of by routine or by habit. But neuroplasticity tells us that we don't have to do it that way, that we can actually train our mind to think differently, and as a result, train ourselves to behave differently. And that's really what we're talking about here when we talk about a mindset shift. And many of you may have this mindset, having led in church for a long time, of recruiting. And here's the reality of recruiting. Recruiting starts with jobs to be done. I don't care if it's volunteers in your church, if it's a business, a company, I don't care what kind of organization it is. I've led in large organizations, had large teams, large staff. We define the roles and we go find somebody to fill the role, right? That's how this works. I don't know if you ever remember this, Ephraim, in any church planner training. One of the things we would try to convince church planners is the size of team that they would need to start their church. And one of the ways we would do this is help people think about how many people it takes to do Sunday. Has anybody ever sat down and calculated how many people it takes to do Sunday at your church? Now, we would just start with a brand new church, right? A baby church, not some big church, not like just a baby church. Now, it does mean probably have to do setup. That's 6 people. Got a little coffee canopy somewhere. That's 4 people. You got kids ministry. That's 10 people. You're going to need some greeters. That's 4 people. You got worship and tech. That's going to be at least 5 people. And by the way, somebody's probably going to preach. That's probably you, right? Does anybody know what that adds up to? That's 30 jobs. 30 jobs for a new church to do church on Sunday. So when we tell a church planner they need a team of 60 people to start a church, you know why? Because if you have 60 people, that means every one of those people has to do one of those jobs every other week, right? Or you can't do church. Maybe you can get some people to do it every week, but it's hard to get people to come to church every week, much less to do a job every week, right? And so all I'm trying to point is, like, that's what happens when we're in recognizing mode, right? We create a list of jobs and then we recruit people to volunteer to do those jobs. If we're going to, or in recruiting mode, if we're going to do recognizing, we have to change that. And recognizing doesn't start with a job. It starts with the person. We start with the person first, which is what we talked about last week, from what to who. 1 Corinthians 12:7, you know these scriptures. I didn't put them on the screen. Now, to each one, the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good, talking about spiritual gifts. Romans 12 says, we have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. If your gift is prophesying, then prophesy according with your faith. It is serving, then serve. If it's teaching, then teach. If it's encouraging, then give encouragement. If it's giving, then give generously. If it's to lead, do it diligently. If it's to show mercy, do it cheerfully. I mean, it's pretty simple, right? Paul's going through this whole list, but the bottom line is if you have a gift, use it, right? Right? That's what he's saying. Now, I want to be really careful here because I don't want to offend anybody. I'm not trying to make anybody mad, but I just want you to think about what you communicate when you give out spiritual gift tests in your church. Are you aware that unintentionally you're communicating several things? One, you're assuming people don't know what their gift is because they need a test to find out. You're assuming that they aren't using it. But here's the worst part. You're communicating to them that you can't or haven't observed it, right? You can't recognize their gift unless they take a test to tell them and you what their gift is. I don't think that matches what Paul says in Romans 12. So what if you took a different approach? What if you thought about spiritual gifts through this lens of observing and recognizing, hey, I noticed when you were talking to that person that, and I don't know, do you guys believe in prophecy? Or are you guys cessationists? I'm gonna get in trouble here. I don't know. Like I noticed that like you shared a prophecy with them. Like I overheard that, right? Hey, I noticed when we were doing that event that like you were the first person to jump in and run around and empty all the garbage cans. Like you really are a servant. Hey, I noticed when you're teaching with those children, those students, like the way the word of God really comes alive. Hey, I noticed, that person that was really struggling with something, the way you came alongside them and encouraged them. I don't know if you guys look at your giving records. I noticed the generosity with which you give to our church. Right? Hey, I've noticed the way that you're leading that ministry. Hey, I noticed that person that was, had challenges, the way you showed mercy to them, right? All it's saying, and there's a lot more gifts than that. It's just saying, are we watching? Are we looking out? And when we see someone do something that's the exercising of a gift, are we going to them and saying, hey, I just saw you use a gift? Now, maybe it's not their gift. I'll be really honest. I don't know that I really have the gift of showing mercy. Actually, every test I've ever taken says my gift of mercy is about this big. But you might actually observe me in some moment being merciful, right? So it might take a little conversation to figure out whether or not that's really my spiritual gift. But my point is, there's a big difference between sort of recruiting. We got this job to fill and recognizing, hey, I can see what God is doing in and through you. And I want to call attention to that and call that out in you. That is a massive mindset shift that comes with this idea of moving from delegating to developing. There's a second shift that maybe is even more significant, and that's a mindset shift from playing to coaching. A player focuses on becoming the best they can be. And that's not bad. As a matter of fact, if your role is playing, that's what you should be doing as a player. Is it clear? Like it's not like that's the job of a player, is to play the very best that they can. But a coach's job is to focus on helping others become the best they can be. I'm going to talk a little football here, and I'm going to be safe. Well, I'm going to be semi-safe because I'm going to assume that in this crew there are some of you who live in Dallas area or Dallas fans, but some of you are from Houston and you are Texan fans. Is there at least a couple Texan fans in here, right? We got a few Texan fans. Okay. By the way, I'm not a Texan fan. I live in California. I live in the Bay Area, grew up in the Bay Area. I'm a 49ers fan. Your Texans are the reason my 49ers didn't win a Super Bowl last year. And I know you're going to say, what are you talking about? Our Texans weren't there. It's because you stole our defensive coordinator and made him your head coach. And that's what I want to talk about, right? DeMeco Ryans played linebacker. Like he played linebacker in college at Alabama. He was the defensive MVP in the 2006 Cotton Bowl. He was drafted as the first pick of the second round. Not super high, but that's kind of a big deal. And he played for the Texans. They drafted him. He was then traded to the Eagles, played with them for a couple of seasons. He won Defensive Rookie of the Year with the Texans. At the Eagles, he played just a couple of seasons, but he led the team in tackles. He tore his Achilles tendon, and that's when his playing career ended. And he started coaching. He is a great coach. The 49ers defense, when he was our defensive coordinator, was the best defense in the league. Your Texans, the year before he joined them, sorry for all of you, they were terrible. And guess what they weren't after they had DeMeco as a coach? They weren't terrible anymore. Why? Because he's a great coach. And here's my point. I don't think D'Amico Ryans will ever make it to the NFL Hall of Fame as a player. I just don't think that'll ever happen. He was a good player, but there's lots of good players. You kind of have to be a good player to play in the NFL. But you know what I think is highly likely? I think it's highly likely by the end of his career, D'Amico Ryans makes it into the NFL as Hall of Fame as a coach. I think it's highly likely your team wins a Super Bowl at some point. That's how good of a coach he is, right? He was a good player. He's a great coach. But there's a challenge to that. And this is what I really want to call attention to. Players are celebrated, coaches are not. Have you ever thought about that? That in our culture, players are celebrated, coaches are not. Andy Reid is the coach of the Kansas City Chiefs. He's coached 4 Super Bowls. He's won 3 of them. He's the highest paid coach in the NFL. He makes $25 million a year. Now, some of you go, that's a lot of money. Okay, and it is. But you know what? Joe Burrow is a quarterback for the Bengals. He's played in 1 Super Bowl and he lost. You know how much he makes? $60 million a year, more than twice what Andy Reid makes, right? Our culture celebrates players, not coaches. Now, why in the world would I tell you something so discouraging? Because in fact, I think it's even worse in the church. And if we're not aware of it, we fall into a terrible trap. Megachurch pastors are celebrated like Super Bowl winning quarterbacks. Whatever town you live in, there are, unless you live in some small town in Texas somewhere, but even then, there's some big town nearby, and there's a bunch of megachurch pastors there, and they get celebrated. They get on the news. They get invited to speak at conferences. They write books that everybody buys, right? They become the celebrities. But multiplying church pastors, they don't even get celebrated like NFL coaches. Nobody even knows their name. Again, why tell you something so discouraging? Because becoming a multiplier, becoming a developer of other people's God-given kingdom potential is a conscious decision on your part to pursue the approval of God rather than the approval of men. It's that simple. Remember, Jesus told this parable of the talents, and it's the same kind of thing, right? We focus on the rock star that got 5 talents and made 5 more, and we focus on the loser who got 1 talent and buried it in the ground. But we almost always skip over the guy in the middle, right? Who got 2 talents and made 2 more. Jesus didn't skip over him. What did Jesus tell him? Well done, good and faithful servant. The exact same words he said to the person who got 5 talents. Now, here's the deal. Growth in a church is not bad. Pastors of megachurches are not bad people. That is not the point that I'm trying to make. If there's a megachurch pastor here, I'm not, right? If God gave you the gifts, talents, and skills to grow and lead a megachurch and you don't, you're like the person who buried the talent in the ground, right? That's the reality of it. But what if God didn't give you the talents to grow, lead, and pastor a mega church? What if God gave you the gifts, talents, and skills to be a multiplier, but instead of being a multiplier, you're trying to be like the celebrity pastor, right? You're trying to be a player instead of a coach, but God gave you the gifts to be a coach, not a player. Being a great developer of people is just as valuable in God's kingdom as being great at growing a church. It's that simple. Here's the only problem. You might have to wait until you meet Jesus face to face to hear, well done. Because we live in a culture that doesn't celebrate that. I will tell you that one of the greatest joys in my life is getting to coach other people. And having had the experience of my life, honestly, of getting to coach people who are way better leaders like Ephraim than I will ever dream of being. I can't believe that God's given me the opportunity. I love it. And I still get to do it. It's amazing. But if you haven't done that, you haven't discovered that joy, right? You have to do it to know how awesome it really is, how great it is to actually equip other people for works of service. I just want to say to you that it's worth it. Making that decision, taking whatever you may still hold on to as the identity of someday I'm going to be a great player, and just putting that on the altar and saying, yep, I'm going to give that to you, God, and I'm going to wear the mantle of coach. You may describe that it's one of the most freeing things, but it's one of the most joyful things that you ever did in ministry. But it sort of takes that identity shift in order to be able to do what we're talking about today well. As long as you wake up in the morning thinking about playing well, it's going to be hard to be a coach. But when you wake up in the morning thinking about coaching well, all of this will become easy. So let's tell you how to do it. Let's tell you how easy it is. And so we're going to talk about having 3 kinds of conversations. And I'm going to tell you right now that apart from the Holy Spirit and prayer, the best tool that you have for equipping others is a conversation. So we're going to talk about discovery conversations. Discovery conversation. What's a discovery conversation? It's helping another person discover their potential for kingdom multiplication. It's just that simple. Helping another person discover their potential. You may be unsure, they may be unsure, that's okay. It's about discovery. That's why we call it a discovery conversation. You're going to have I see and you conversations. Now, they're a little different because I see and you conversations are calling attention to other people's kingdom potential and inviting them to pursue it, right? This means you see the potential. You see what they could do. This is me and my friend Craig DeBlasi and seeing this guy shouldn't just be leading a small group. He should be making small group leaders, right? I saw potential in him that no one else had seen yet. And so that's an I see and you conversation. And then coaching conversations are just the process of developing others. It's the actual ongoing development of another person, right? So 3 kinds of conversations. Now, these are not difficult. I'm going to give you some tools. We're going to go through those in details next. These are not difficult conversations to have. They do require being intentional and purposeful. These conversations don't happen by accident, is what I'm saying. So it's sort of like you pray for your neighbor to meet Jesus, right? But you never actually have a conversation with your neighbor and tell them about Jesus, right? And it's not bad to pray for your neighbor, but if you're really intentional and purposeful about wanting your neighbor to meet Jesus, you're also going to have a conversation with them, right? We're asking you to pray for people who could become multipliers. That's important. But at some point, you also have to have intentional, purposeful conversations with them about that reality. And so it takes intention. That's why we've challenged you to do at least one of these conversations a week. But then the other thing that I want you to know is that these conversations are powerful. Powerful conversations. They change the course of someone's life. I would ask some of you, has your life, the course of your life, ever been changed by a conversation? I shared with you last week, I was a 25-year-old frustrated student pastor. If you have one of those in your church, call me. I'll give you some tips. I was a 25-year-old frustrated student pastor. I was mad at my senior pastor. I was mad at everybody. And I had enough wisdom to call a mentor of mine and sit down and have lunch with him. And at the end of that lunch, he looked at me and says, "What do you think about starting a church?" That question changed my life. We're having this conversation today because he asked me that question, because we had that lunch and we had that conversation. Conversations are that powerful. Most of you on this call, I think, I don't know, but there's a whole bunch of you that are preachers, right? You're working on a message right now for Sunday. All right. So you believe in the power of words. If you didn't, you wouldn't prepare those messages and get up on Sunday and teach them. You believe in the power of words to change people's lives. That's part of why you do what you do. And again, I don't want to offend all of you, but here's the reality. Dialogue is even more powerful than monologue. Imagine if you actually had the time to have a conversation with every person in your church about the message you are preparing for Sunday. Would that message, that sermon be more effective if it was a one-on-one conversation? I would guess everyone would say, yeah, it would. The issue is you don't have time to do that, right? And so we trust the Holy Spirit to work through that process when we teach. But the point is, dialogue, conversations are incredibly powerful. They're the most powerful tool we have in any conversation. Jesus was asked 307 questions, or sorry, Jesus asked 307 questions in the scripture, right? If you read, somebody did this, like I always find this, read the entire, all four gospels, and every time Jesus asked a question, boom, boom, they wrote it down. 300 times Jesus asked a question. Here's the funny part. He was asked 183 questions. Anybody know how many he answered? Has anybody heard this before? People come up with two different answers. Some people say answered 3. Some people say he answered, can't do 6. Either way, that is a fraction of the questions that he was asked. And you know part of why that is? Because when people ask Jesus a question, what was his most common response? To ask them a question back, correct? So Jesus understood the power of questions, and that's what we're going to give you. We're going to give you 3 tools here that are questions. That's all they are. They're just questions. So let's talk about discovery conversations. A discovery conversation helps people explore how God might work in and through them to accomplish his mission, right? The purpose, and I want to be really clear, the purpose of this conversation is not to answer what it is God might call them to do. The purpose of this conversation is to inspire curiosity that will lead them to an exploration of what God might want them to do. Because you're probably not going to answer it in one conversation, especially if neither of you know, right? That's just not going to happen. Now, the discovery conversation might provide insight into a bunch of things about a person. I don't know if you remember last week, I sort of introduced this framework to you of thinking about a person's character, about their calling, about their competency, about their capacity, and depending on what they're called to, it's about their companion, their spouse, and how they work together in ministry. These discovery conversations could focus on any one of those things. Let me say that, like, you could have a discovery conversation about character, about calling, about competency, about any one of these things could sort of be the focus. But again, the idea is to instill curiosity. And so here's, and I'm going to give you little cards when we're all done, but here's just a picture of what this card looks like here for a discovery conversation. The discovery conversation starts with 2 powerful questions. One is, and just set it up this way, say to the person, if you were having this conversation with Jesus, what would Jesus tell you he wants to do in you right now? Now, a couple assumptions here. We are assuming that this person is a follower of Jesus. We're making some assumptions that they're actually paying a little bit of attention to Jesus or what the Holy Spirit might be telling them. And you might think to yourself, they don't know the answer to the question. They might not know the answer, but part of why they don't know the answer is no one's asking them. They haven't taken time to think about it. And that's what you're going to challenge them to do. And my experience is if you'll ask that question and stay quiet long enough, people will tell you what the answer is. They probably know. It's at some level or intuitive, they'll figure out, yeah, this is what Jesus wants to do in me right now. The second one would be, what would Jesus tell you he wants to do through you to accomplish his mission, right? How could God use them? What is their kingdom potential? Now, again, in this framework, the in you question is really about character, maybe about their capacity, their healthy habits. The through you question is more about calling and about competency, right? So we're sort of getting at a couple different dynamics of this. Now, when they answer that, or when they say, I think the answer might be this, there's an invitation that you can extend to them. And again, it's a question. Would you be willing to spend a season exploring the answer to that question, right? Would you be willing to spend a season diving into this with me? And I'll walk alongside you as they do that. That's a discovery conversation. I remember a young guy named Mike that I had a relationship with. And he had a sense of calling. You guys, maybe you've been in the shoes, maybe you know someone like this, where they sort of have this sense of calling, like God wants to do something through me, but I just can't quite figure out what it was. And part of it was, it kind of felt like, well, if God wants to do something through me, I should become a pastor, right? That's sort of the assumption, but somehow that just wasn't clicking for him. And so we just started having these conversations. Neither one of us knew where they were going to lead, but what we began to talk about and realize was that he came from a military family. Like not like his dad, like a military. You guys know what that's like a military family. Like every man in his family for 3 generations has been in the military. He didn't feel like he was called to be a soldier. But you know what we figured out? He did feel called to care for soldiers. And so guess what he did? He enlisted and he became a chaplain. And he realized that's what God's calling me to do. I can be part of the military, which is what my family's been all about, and I can pursue God's calling in my life. Neither he nor I saw that going into our conversation. The first discovery conversation, like, no, like I didn't show up saying, hey, Mike, you should be a chaplain. That wasn't the conversation. It took weeks, actually took months to arrive at that. But he had still has an amazing role as a chaplain in the military. That's what discovery conversations lead to. Okay, so that's the first kind of conversation, a discovery conversation. Let's talk about an I see and you conversation. Here's the difference between these two conversations. When I sat down with Mike, I had no idea what Mike's kingdom potential was, and neither did he. But when you have an I see and you conversation, like I did with my friend Craig about small groups, I did have an idea what I saw for kingdom potential, right? And so an I see and you conversation calls attention to the kingdom potential you have observed in another purpose. And the purpose is to help that person see what you see, right? To help them like, hey, this is what I see. Do you see that too? I want to help you see that too. Now, I did not make this up, by the way. If anybody's ever read books by Dave Ferguson, I think he's written about this in like 3 of his books. Hero Maker is probably the book most people read, most of his, where he talks about this. So I didn't make this up. Dave Ferguson, founder of Community Christian Church in Chicago. He's the president of Exponential, brilliant guy. But this idea stuck because it's so powerful. And it's one worth adopting. So how do you do this? And again, it's fairly simple, except this time it starts with an observation. This is why that power of recognizing is so important, right? You share with them an observation. Hey, I see blank in you. Maybe it's a character quality. Hey, I see patience as a character. I see joy. I see okay, whatever. There's a whole list of fruits of the spirit that you could see in somebody. There are character qualities. Man, I see a calling to Jesus' mission. Maybe you see something that God could be calling them to do, some circumstance that says, hey, God could be calling you to lead in this area, to serve these people, or go plant a church, whatever it would be. Maybe it's a competency, a gift, a talent, or a skill that you've observed. It could be any of those things, but you're sharing with them, hey, I see this in you. And then you want to ask for a response. And it's a simple question. Hey, what's your response to hearing my observation about you? Now, I'll tell you, almost always the first response people have is, I can't believe you noticed. Because you know what? Think about your own life. How many people have sat down and had an I see and you conversation with you? I would guess, sadly, it's not many. And so when someone actually sits down and says, I see you, and especially if you got it right, that's a powerful moment for somebody just to hear those words like, wow, you saw that. But then they'll begin to talk about their questions, their dreams, their doubts, all kinds of things in response to that statement. And again, this conversation ends with an invitation. Would you be willing to spend a season exploring this, whatever it is that you've seen, that you've identified? Just ask them, hey, would you be willing to spend a season exploring this potential? So again, just a simple series of questions that become, well, one statement and some questions that become an I see you conversation. All right, one more, a coaching conversation. Coaching conversations challenge another person to pursue growth in a specific aspect of their calling, character, calling, competency, capacity, or their companion, right? This is the growth conversation, right? And the purpose is to inspire and identify actual growth steps. This is where, to be honest, and athletics isn't always the best metaphor for everything, but it's kind of like, I don't know, anybody on the call have a personal trainer or ever had a personal trainer? Or maybe if you've ever, you played sports and you've had a coach, right? Like coaches give you stuff to do, right? Or at least they call attention to stuff that you got to go practice, right? Coach isn't just about listening to somebody talk. Coach is about doing things. Being coach is about doing things that actually cause you to get better, to become better, to do better. And so again, a coaching conversation, 2 questions that focus it. How do you want to be better? It's just a simple question. Now it's about being, it's about character. It's about healthy habits. What do you want to do better, right? That's about their competency, their gifts, their talents, or their skills. Now, part of why we ask them this rather than communicate that, there is a lot of research into, adult learning theory. Any educators on the call, you'll recognize this. And one of the things that's really important for adults, if you want them to grow and to change, is that they choose what they want to learn, or how they want to grow. So if you go and you tell somebody you need to get better at this, unless you're their boss and you have a paycheck to hold over their head, you're probably not going to get very far. But if you ask the question and somebody says, you know what, I really want to get better about talking to my coworkers about Jesus, now you can take some coaching steps, right? Because they've said, I want to get better at this. And so that's the power of those questions. Then you want to prompt creativity. So here's one of the things that I want to say to you. The goal of this is you don't have to be the expert at everything that someone wants to get better at, right? That's probably why you don't have coaching conversations. Like, I don't know how to help them get better at that. You don't have to. All you have to do is be able to prompt creativity. They'll come up with it. How could you become better in this way? Well, I could do this. I could do this. I could do this. Now, at some point, we'll get to the offered help, but you'll be surprised how much people have ideas how they get better. They just haven't done them. And then you want to challenge them. Name the growth step. What next step will you take to become better? And part of being a great coach is also saying, and when are you going to do that? And when are we going to talk about how it went, right? And that's your next coaching conversation. And then this is important. Offer to help. Ask them, hey, how can I help you complete these steps? Don't leave it entirely up to them. Make yourself available to help them accomplish this thing. But you can't do it for them, right? But maybe there is something they need help with. Maybe they need an introduction to someone. Maybe, I don't know what it be. There's lots of things you can do to help people in your church grow in this way. And so that's a coaching conversation. Okay, so 3 kinds of conversations, right? We have discovery conversations. Neither you or they really have any idea what's next for them in God's kingdom, but we want to find out. And so we just sit down and we discover together what that might be. I see a new conversation. Someone you've put on your scouting guide, you're like, man, I see these gifts. I see maybe this calling in them. I'm going to sit down with them and I'm going to call that out. I'm going to share that with them and I'm going to ask them about that and see where that goes. And then coaching conversations, when you're actually in a developmental relationship with someone and they've said, yeah, I want to get better, then you've got a simple conversation guide every time to sort of help them identify what are they going to do next to grow. 3 pretty simple tools to be able to accomplish. And these are available. Again, this download, they're in 3 forms. You can download a PDF of them. I know that 9 out of 10 of you on the call have an iPhone, and I don't know how to use an iPhone. So I put images there that if you know how to use your iPhone, you can actually take those images and save them like in the photos on your phone or in a folder. And then if you're sitting having coffee with somebody or a meal with somebody, you can just click on that image, right? And it'll bring up, these are like little, flashcard like things, right? Where you're like, how do I have this ICNU conversation? You can just store it on your phone, click on it, bring it up. And oh yeah, that's what I'm supposed to do. I say this and I ask this. So each one of these is a separate card that you can download and you can just put on your phone to have, and it's sort of as a guide for those conversations. Now, I know that, I shouldn't say, I can guess that for many of you, the resistance to this is not necessarily that you don't want to have these conversations. The resistance is time, right? Everybody has more to do than they can do. When am I? So this just starts to feel like one more thing to do. But here's the reality, and this is back to multiplying. What else are you doing that by doing it, you are creating more capacity for your church rather than consuming capacity, right? That's what these conversations are. These are conversations that increase capacity rather than draw from what limited capacity there already are. Now, I'll be honest, it might take a little time. It might not happen overnight, but if you do this consistently, it will increase the capacity of the people in your church, which will increase the overall capacity of your church. And that's what it means to become a multiplying church. And that's why the request is really simple. So you remember, go back to what we talked about last time. The request isn't have 20 of these conversations a week. That's a recipe for failure. I'll just be really honest. You won't have any. The request is really simple. Have 1 of these conversations every week. Make this more important than a couple of other things that you're doing that take up an hour of your time, an hour and a half of your time, and have 1 of these conversations a week. Now, I will tell you this, and this is back to intentionality. You will have to schedule these. These kinds of conversations don't go well if you just pick up the phone and call somebody, right? These conversations go much better when you say, hey, can we get together? I have something I want to talk to you about. Now, once you enter a coaching relationship, then it's even more like, hey, can we, we sort of schedule what we know is a coaching call. So it requires some intentionality, but I think if like I know in my case, I started doing this pretty early in my ministry and I got hooked. Like I got to where I would rather spend my time coaching than doing almost anything else. Because having these kinds of conversations is where I saw other people's potential and capacity just explode and see people do all kinds of things in God's kingdom that I could never do. And it was awesome. And so I'm hooked on this. I'm hoping that you'll have enough of these conversations that you realize how powerful they are and you get hooked on them. And then you'll keep having them and then you'll make more time for them in your schedule. But right now, we're just asking for one conversation a week to give this a try. All right. Efren, I'll give it back to you. Questions that I can answer, comments that anybody has, and actually I'll stop sharing my screen as well so that
Yeah.
we can
No,
process.
that is fantastic. Thank you so much for that content. And it's so true. We have to be intentional. These conversations are a game changer in raising up future leaders. I know for me personally, that's how I started in ministry. I started attending a church in central Pennsylvania, and the pastor there had an IC&U conversation. My wife and I were just attending. We were sitting in a back row. We were just kind of getting a feel for all of this. And he was intentional. Hey, let's go have lunch. Hey, let's get to know one another. And in that relationship that he invested in me, he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, "Hey, I see in you leadership in ministry," and that was a game changer for me. And God used him to catapult me into ministry. So as you're sharing this, I'm like, wow, that's exactly what happened for me. And I'm so grateful for that pastor that really invested in me. So and actually that is something that I'm able to see and do as well, is be able to invest in others. So thank you so much for sharing that. Any questions from anyone regarding what you heard today?
Hey, I just wanted to share. This is Manny Cirillo. I'm pastor in Kilgore, Texas. But I am a direct result of IC&U conversations. Honestly, if my brother called that out in me when I was just trying to fill that void by filling in wherever they needed me at the campus, and so I thought I would get by just helping out here and helping out there and leading youth, but it was the no. I appreciate your serving, but it's God has a calling on your life. There is ministry in your future. You're a pastor and you don't even know it, but let's walk that journey together. And the beauty of that is that I've been able to adopt that same principle, and because of that, I've seen that same trajectory in the lives of three other young men in my congregation, because I saw it modeled first, and so I can go and do it, and then encourage them to go and do it as well. So great information today. I thank you so much for that, just your wonderful wisdom and your insights. And I just want to encourage everyone, if you're not having those conversations, those are the conversations that would change your ministry.
Amen.
Yeah. Yeah. Just, and I know you all lead churches. I know these conversations, but just think about this. Would you rather sit in a board meeting and have a conversation about new carpet, or would you rather sit down with somebody and have an IC&U conversation? Like, which of those do you want to spend your time doing? I've done both, I know. Which of those do you want to do?
Sure. Are there any other questions or comments related to workshop number 2?
Even I just want to hop in here to say, I think one of the things that I've noticed as well in regard to like a culture of multiplication is really teaching your leaders how to have these conversations with others they serve with, right? So like I used to think that like I was the only one who should ever have this kind of conversation with anybody. But if I can get even volunteer leaders, like not even necessarily just staff, but I can get volunteer leaders to begin to look for and speak to some things in other volunteers that they're in, like it's that culture of multiplication that really can go throughout the whole organization. It doesn't have to be just me as the leader. It really can be all of us like speaking those things into each other's lives. That's it just kind of raises everybody to that next step, right? And man, just creates a lot of opportunity there. This is good stuff.
My friend Craig that I told you about earlier, I mean, that's what happened, right? That's how we had so many more small group leaders, because he was great at having IC&U conversations, probably better at it than I was. And so it was calling that out in him and empowering him to go do that. And so, yeah, and by the way, you'll notice there's no, I mean, yeah, the logo's on here, I get that, but there's no copyright on any of these things. So like, you don't have to pay money for it, if they're helpful, I don't even care, take my logo off of it, copy just a text and put them on some little card with your own church's name on them. I don't care. I would rather people be taught how to have these conversations than that they ever see our logos. So please replicate these in your church.
Somebody had a conversation like that with me when I was 15, 16 years old. And so just to be mindful that you have students who very much have gifts and would never dream of some of the things that God might have in store for them unless somebody speaks it to them.
Yep.
Yeah, that's great.
I think that illustrates one thing too that I probably should have included in the talk, but for you, one of the challenge of this is you are in recognizing you are looking for potential, not readiness. And here's the reality that I think easily forget. God calls people before they're ready. You're telling me that when God called Simon Peter out of the boat beside the Sea of Galilee, that Simon Peter was ready to be the leader of the church in Jerusalem? Like, come on, not a chance in the world was he ready, right? But Jesus could see the potential. God called Paul to be a missionary to the Gentiles when Paul was on his way to put Jews in prison. Like, God calls people before they're ready. And so part of it is for us is to have the same kind of mindset of being able to see potential. I would be like you, Chelsea. My youth pastor was the first person that ever had an IC&U conversation with me. I was 16 years old. I know I was a pastor's kid. My best friend was an elder's kid. We caused more trouble in church and youth group than any two kids that ever went through that church. But instead of being angry with us, that youth pastor sat down and said, hey, I see potential in you. And that's a huge part of why I'm a disciple maker and in ministry today. He saw potential when I definitely wasn't ready. It's just the inherent nature. And so that's part of it, and that's the other problem of the filling the jobs, right? When we have a role to fill and we're looking for a volunteer, guess what we're looking for? Someone who's ready to start doing that job when? This Sunday. Right? And so we inherently stop looking for potential and start looking for readiness. When we start recognizing, we start looking for potential and developing readiness. It's a big, big shift to make that shift.
Yeah, and I actually love that you're essentially playing the long game, right? Mm-hmm. You're essentially looking down the field, looking down a year from now, right? Who has God sent to our churches that he wants you to invest in and to raise up? And yeah, that is a shift that we should start having. And also, I want to challenge everybody here as well, and maybe for those who are listening and that were not able to make it, what do you think is preventing you from moving into that direction? And we all said time, but what if we were to take 10% of our time and we focus on having these conversations with individuals in our congregations? That's just a low number, right? But you know your schedule better than anybody else. You know what time you need to be in. You know what your family life is like. You know what the church life is like, the ministry life is like. But I want you to take an assessment of your schedule, evaluate your schedule, see where you're spending your time, and see what you can change, rearrange, so that you can begin moving into having these conversations that are a game changer. And as you do that, I truly believe that you'll start seeing some things change towards
Yeah,
that.
that's one of the others. I have a list of 10 shifts. We're only talking about 3 of them. But one of them is from now to later. We live in an instant culture. And we tend to think in a manufacturing mindset, right? That when we do something, we should see the results of it immediately. Jesus had the advantage in his day that people in his day lived in an agricultural society. And so they knew that when you planted seeds, you had to make it, at the minimum wait weeks, sometimes months, sometimes you waited a whole year. Sometimes if you're planting orchards, right? And you just talked about fig trees. It might take 5 years for a new fig tree to bear any fruit, several years for a vine to bear fruit. So they had more of this long-term mentality that was just sort of built into their culture and the way they live their life. But we're just so used to everything, I do A, B happens right now. And that's not how this works. This is a shift from focusing on now to focusing on later. And I'm going to do something today that's going to produce incredible fruit somewhere down the road. But it won't be tomorrow, won't be next week, won't be next month. It'll take time to get there.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Craig. And also want to thank everyone else for taking the time and joining us here for workshop number 2. Are there any final words, Craig, that you are wanting to share?
I just want to encourage you to do it. Like, as I shared, that this is one of my greatest joys when I get to have, conversations with people. And so, I get sort of that tension, the time, whatever, but it's something that becomes rewarding if you will do it. And so whatever it sort of requires, like start doing it, do it. Because I'm pretty confident as soon as you do, you will actually, like I said, you'll be saying, no, I want to actually do more of this. So make the effort to get started. It will, even though you might not see the fruit for a while, the conversations will bring sort of an immediate joy and an immediate reward that will make you realize, yeah, I actually want to spend more of my time doing this.
I just
Amen.
want to say this was very powerful, very, very powerful for us to sit in here and get this training. It's such good information as we are starting out. So we are just very grateful, Craig and Ephraim, for this training session, because I love it when you said God calls you before you're ready, but he equips you. And this is an equipping process for us. And we are so grateful for this opportunity.
Well, that's great. I went ahead and I am actually going to put let me see for everyone. I'm going to actually put the website on the chat, and also too a couple links for you so that you can have access to this. We have a recalibrate podcast, and so workshop number 1 is on the podcast. Workshop number 2, this one will also be on the podcast as well, and also on YouTube. And so it gives you an opportunity to go back, listen to it with your teams or people that you really would like for them to hear this. Because I truly believe as we start applying this and really taking steps forward in making this part of our ministry, we will be able to see some progress in multiplication. So thank you so much for your time. And if you haven't done so, subscribe to our Recalibrate podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and also iTunes as well. And so we are looking forward to seeing what God does in your ministries and in your congregations. And also mark down our next one. Workshop number 3 is coming up October 23rd at noon, and we'll be here on this call. So we are excited about this workshop number 3 and looking forward to see what God does with that. Workshop number 3 is actually from equipping members to equipping missionaries. And so we're going to be able to explore practice fields to prepare your congregation for mission work. So excited about that as we continue to make disciples who make disciples. Thank you so much for joining us. And I pray you have a great rest of the day. Take care, guys.